Bueno, muchas gracias. Me voy a presentar en inglés porque es un poco más fácil para mí y creo que es más fácil para ustedes también porque mi castellano es medio mal después de unos meses que no practica nada. Entonces vamos a empezar en inglés.
¿Cómo sería si lo practicas?
Bueno, sí, por eso. Y bueno, vamos a empezar en inglés, pero y la otra cosa es que si yo empezar a hablar más rápido, ustedes tienen que decirme, bueno, tranquilo, despacio, vamos a hablar sobre un poco de BRIC. But Felix, thank you very, very much for inviting me to CARI. I've been to CARI now, I think I've been coming here for about the last 10 years, and it always promises to be a very interesting and fruitful discussion. Ambassador, thank you very much for bringing me here as well to CARI. And I hope that we can. How long should I present for? We're going to open up into discussion. What is going to be the format?
5 or 6 hours.
5 or 6 hours. That sounds like a BRIC. That sounds like a BRIC summit.
Normally we have 20 minutes presentation and then we have a discussion.
Okay, great. Okay, so we'll keep it as informal as possible. I think we started off, and what was interesting, it was interesting to hear your perspective of our much wanted invitation to actually join BRIC on the 24th of December. It's an interesting date that they chose to actually invite us to join BRIC, but as many people know, that's when the Chinese actually usually voice and implement a lot of their foreign policy issues, especially some of the more significant ones, right, during the period of festivities and over the Western world's Christmas holidays. Before I actually launch into what BRIC is, the explanation of BRIC and South Africa's invitation to join this club of heavyweights, let me just talk a little bit about what GIBS is, the Gordon Institute of Business Science, and then more specifically what the CDM, the Center for Dynamic Markets is, and what we are doing. And to answer or to elaborate a little bit on what Felix was what he mentioned around the concept of dynamic markets, because I thought this might tickle your interest, given your personal interest in the subject. GIBS, just very briefly, is a very young business school in the middle of Johannesburg, in Illovo near Sandton, which is really the commercial centre of South Africa, or the commercial centre, you know, if you wanted to be quite bold about this, of Africa. And we call ourselves a business school. We're very young, but we have got we are driving ahead, or surging ahead forward very ambitiously in what we see as our role and our agenda in developing links for business, or for more specifically for executive education. And we rank very, very highly alongside some of the business schools here in Argentina, Brazil. So this is quite important, but more specifically around dynamic markets and the Center for Dynamic Markets. GIBS has quite recently reorientated or reprioritized its role in developing general management in dynamic markets. So if you want to really play on these acronyms, it would be GM, CDMs, which we're not going to go into those things. But anyway, but the whole idea really is to understand, to research, and then to teach about general management and general management practices in dynamic markets. Now, what are dynamic markets? That is a giant panda from China. Now, I'm going to go into a very, very quick explanation. And the idea is not that we actually go into a debate about what dynamic markets are and whether they are emerging markets, but really, dynamic markets are that loose collection of what we have generally called emerging and developing markets. That the dynamic markets explain this restless energy that all these markets have, whether they be in South Asia, East Asia, Africa, Latin America, and it's more descriptive and more encompassing to describe them as dynamic markets. Now, so it's quite simply those markets that aren't mature markets at this stage, and we've identified some of them at GIBS, and we're going to be studying them. And just to give you an illustration, the reason why I've used this giant panda, there's a wonderful book written by an author and a journalist by the name of Alan Beatty. And as Argentines, I suggest you read this book because he starts off with a chapter comparing the economic history and decision making in Argentina with that of the United States. and why these two countries that started off with pretty much the same economic wealth and similar trajectories have ended up in vastly different locations just 80 years later. So it's quite a creative and quite a funny book, but it's also very, very important in understanding economic decision making and policy making in a country. Anyway, so Alan Beattie, what he did was he draws a very fun and simple analogy between mature markets and these giant pandas. And what he does is he manages to offend the entire conservation world by suggesting then that these very cute and adorable giant pandas that everybody loves to look at are actually they're nearing extinction because they're unable to adapt to a rapidly changing environment. And really, and if you look at them, they're physically impeding, or physically awkward. Sorry, and even impeding in times. They feed on this nutritionally absent bamboo. And I know we're in a very formal setting, but I'll have to say so. If anybody knows anything about the giant pandas in San Diego Zoo, they need near pornographic material to encourage them to reproduce in captivity. So these are not this is not your example of the most kind of progressive and self-reliant animal on earth that needs a lot of help. And basically, Beattie goes on to suggest that these animals, these mature markets, as he suggests, have disappeared down or are disappearing down an evolutionary cul-de-sac, and they are defunct in an era of rapid change and modernization. Obviously, this is quite controversial, but this is where we see some of the old mature markets going. And then you contrast this with, I don't know if you have those here, but that's the Indian myna. Now, the Indian myna is this bird which is common. I've seen it common in most developing regions around the world, and particularly most urbanized regions. And it hails from the subcontinent, India and Pakistan, and it's made its home very pleasantly, and it's adapted to its environment very, very quickly across the planet. And these are birds that can adjust their call, their feeding habits. They even inhabit other birds' nests and homes. And just quite simply, they do this to ensure their survival, and they are exceptionally successful as well at what they do. So in many respects, these Indian mynas represent those highly energetic, increasingly successful dynamic markets. And I know, okay, there is a word of warning here. With analogies, there's always a word of warning. That the Indian myna is also known for their adverse behavior of stealing from other birds, of doing some nasty things to some of those other birds to ensure their survival. And I think, while somebody said I should be careful of this analogy, I think this actually does illustrate somewhat those dynamic markets that we're talking about. They really are. They do also illustrate the darkest side of the dynamic markets, that darkest side associated with corruption and nepotism. And this is something that we have to think about in terms of policy making, in terms of nurturing the energy, this restless energy that we have in these dynamic markets, and pursue an agenda that optimizes the restless energy in a positive way, instead of harping on those areas of what we call in economics and business school talk, institutional voids and other areas of corruption and nepotism. Anyway, so that's just a very, very, and you and I can go into this for hours again over lunch or something like that to talk about what we mean by dynamic markets. But what is important then is that in dynamic markets, and I think what is very, very important at this stage, just to give you an indication, dynamic markets are all about growth, innovation, and this adaptation to a rapidly modernizing world. And what we see now in 2011 is that growth in the dynamic world, among dynamic markets, will be in the region of about 6.7% up to 7% on average over this year and over the years to come. Whereas in the mature markets, that growth is going to struggle to reach 2%. So basically, the growth is going to be concentrated. More than 80% of the future global economic growth will be in dynamic markets or in the dynamic world. In essence, what has happened is that growth has shifted from the west and the north to the south and the east, and debt has in turn shifted from the south and the east to the north and the west. And that's a major shift that has taken place. And at the center of all this growth and this excitement is that is the BRIC. The BRIC is really the hard core of what we call dynamic markets. It is the center of our world of dynamic markets. And really it's, but what I should really point out at this stage is that, and this is what I promote, especially through my center at Gibbs, is that Gibbs, Gibbs BRIC is just really the start of everything. It's something that we've seen already. Over the last 10 years, the last decade was really the BRIC decade. And I certainly believe that 2011 and going forward into the next decade is really going to be the dynamic market decade, where we see this next tier of dynamic markets with South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia, Vietnam, and perhaps even Argentina being one of those countries that is really on the next phase of these exciting new countries that are attracting all the investment, a lot of trade, or they're involved in a lot of trade and a lot of growth. What I'm going to do very quickly is, there's some questions. And sorry, I'm not going to, this is not going to be death by PowerPoint. I'm not really sticking to the slides, as you might see as I go along. But just to give you some ideas and some questions that we need to actually rectify and put out there for the discussion. And just so that there is some clarity around BRIC, because one of the things that I found in my reading and writing and teaching about BRIC is how little is actually known about this and how much is just assumed. It's almost like the Washington Consensus in Latin America. Everybody believed, everybody knew exactly what the Washington Consensus was, but they forgot that it was just something that was dreamt up at a conference in Washington by John Williamson some years back, and then they just assumed that this was the lightning rod of evil for the rest of Latin America. BRIC has assumed very much a similar thing. It's something that was just dreamt up. It was the creative musings of a Goldman Sachs economist, and his name is Jim O'Neill, in 2001, and he really just put this cluster of countries together, these fast-growing and populous countries together, and he just coined the term BRIC. And what happened then was these countries did begin to grow, and Brazil was no exception, because Brazil, as we know, didn't grow for about 20 years, or didn't grow effectively for 20 years. And along with really led by the charge of China and India, these countries really developed a life of their own. Now, it was all about, as I say, all about economic potentials of comparative, and those economists in the room will know about Ricardian comparative advantage. This is all about Ricardian comparative advantage, and it's all based on population size and growth trajectory. That is very important. BRIC is all about population size and growth trajectory. So, since 2000, and there's just some data for you, it's not really anything profound, but this became the new destination for investment expansion and for company location. Just quite simply, if companies needed to grow their market share, they had to go into those BRIC economies. That was just a commonly accepted phenomenon about BRIC. Inward and outward, very importantly, outward investment, foreign direct investment stock has increased over the last 10 years dramatically. Outward investment is in the region of now nearly $1 trillion, which is enormous, because this also represents an evolution of these countries, that they are not just recipients of FDI, they are also now providing FDI, and they are becoming some of the biggest providers of investment across the developing and the dynamic world, especially now in Africa. We sit in Africa and we look at huge amounts of investment flowing in from China, India, and increasingly now Brazil, and they're competing with South African companies. BRIC's global output has doubled. It's now a large contributor. I can give you the data for that as well, but it's one of the largest contributors of output and economic growth. And all this major shift from, like I said, from north to south, west to east, all this has been accelerated by all the drama around the financial and what became the global economic crisis. What is very important to point out now, I started off being somewhat of a critic, I wouldn't say a cynic, of South Africa's invitation to join BRIC. And I started thinking about this a little bit longer, which led me to really coming out to this point, is that BRIC has moved beyond just simply purely an economic point of reference. Which is still used today by the credit rating agencies and by investors to say, well, you know, the BRIC countries are investment locations. But BRIC has moved beyond that. BRIC has taken on a life of its own. You picture Frankenstein or something. It's the countries that are now part of the acronym have adopted it, and they've gone beyond this orthodox acronym that was given to it by Goldman Sachs. And as the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Singh, has said, the first meeting that took place in Russia in 2009 breathed life into the acronym, and it's become its own acronym now. But that's not to say that BRIC at this stage is any formal bloc or alliance of partners. It is still some type of acronym, and we have to just see how this actually unfolds. But there is a point to be made that this has now gone beyond just purely a market collective. It's no longer just a market collective that was coined by those creative musings of the Goldman Sachs economists. So despite all this evolution, as I said, the acronym has a life of its own. I think it's important to note, though, that BRIC is far, as I said, far from a formal bloc or alliance of partners. It lacks any real political and economic cohesion or consensus or strategy. These heads of state that get together don't really have a common agenda. These are fundamentally, and we forget this, the scales, the economies of scale that they are collectively made up of, disguise the competitiveness and sometimes the conflictual relationship between these countries. On the side, really, India and Brazil are the two countries in the WTO, or as members of the WTO, are the two countries that have the highest number of trade disputes with China, and they're part of BRIC. So we must remember that there's very little in the form of consensus and really friendship within this makeup. There are serious internal issues, and I think this is going to define 2011 and going forward for dynamic markets and for BRIC in particular. It's the whole issue around currency valuation. We always think about currency valuation and we think about the currency wars as the Minister of Finance from Brazil coined it. We always think of it between China and the United States. It's actually more between China and Brazil, and China and the rest of the dynamic world, because China has stepped away from the norm of the currency valuation, and this is a huge and hotly debated issue in South Africa at the moment around our economic strategy and our development path, is the whole currency issue. So that is something I think that is really going to be at the forefront of BRIC, and is going to South Africa is going to be a pivotal country in this, because we're going to have to really develop our diplomatic prowess and our negotiating skills if we are going to enter into this. We can't really enter into the whole BRIC conundrum with our eyes wide shut, you know. Little in the form of unified. This is very important in terms of global issues and a global agenda. When South Africa was first invited as a great Christmas present to join BRIC, there was a lot of talk about how it would attract foreign investment, but most importantly, it was going to put us back. We were all members or we were non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. That's nonsense. Quite simply, BRIC has got nothing to do with the United Nations Security Council. You can't have India and China on the same platform and even hope to actually discuss areas of the United Nations Security Council. So that was something that South Africa totally misinterpreted. I don't know if it was as clear to them as it was, but maybe it was just part of the festive season press releases or sound bits that were coming out at the time. Really, just to go beyond the BRIC now, and what is South Africa a BRIC, and what does this mean, or what about the rest? What about the other